everybody. This is Ahmed, and this is another episode of the Breakout podcast here at the School of Advanced Studies, SAS, University of Timir. Today, I have with me a very special guest, Stanimir. He is our professor. He is the major leader of Cultural Studies major. Stanimir is an author. There are 2 books coming out this year, right? One on objects, and the second one is on the disembodiment of late antiquity, right? And today we are gonna be talking about cultural studies. What is it? How is it different from what is being known about this culturologia? And Stanimir is gonna guide us on how to differentiate between cultural studies and other, what is it even about, and also what people who study who are taking the major or simply majored in culture studies, what they can do after their graduation, whether on pursuing academic career or simply beyond academia. So, Stanimir, thank you so much really for coming in today.
Thank you for having me. So maybe just let's start with the clarification for non-Russian speakers who watch this podcast, that I know there's a different word in Russian, but also other Slavic languages that coincides very often with what in English is generally called cultural studies. That the word here in Russian will be культурология. By analogy, sometimes actually in English you can hear politology. I've heard it again, but not so often. There it's usually political science. So enough, I guess, on that point. So already in the linguistic articulation, there's a difference between, I don't know, logos and studies, right? They're not far away from each other, but, they articulate slightly different things. Kulturologia, especially in Eastern Europe, in the post-Soviet space, became a thing sometimes in the mid-80s, early 90s, right? So it really mushroomed in terms of publications that were not widely acceptable among the scientific communities until the kind of end of state socialism. So we can see in the entirety of the post-Soviet space how the early 90s actually see this vast sweeping wave of publications of extremely important writers in culturologia, but not only. So some of them can be categorized easily also in so in a sense, what I've seen in the non-English context, but I also come from a post-Soviet country, is that it's not like there's some kind of predetermined concept of what is culturology. It should be a word, right? But it comes with a certain luggage. So let me first explain what's this kind of conceptual luggage of culturologia, now that it became acceptable in the early 90s. And when I say acceptable, I do not mean that people didn't do cultural studies or studies of what is actually culture. Obviously, a lot of people did it in the kind of communist scientific communities and countries. But if you look at the history, and if you look at the concepts of culture being promoted, particularly in the early 90s, you can't see that much of studies or foreign authors being translated who deal with what we will more consensually call culture nowadays. Of course, in cultural studies proper, there's more than 100 normative definitions of culture, but the important thing here is that in the kind of state socialist epoch, the vast majority of publication, if not all, but mostly all, are focused on something that actually today we will associate with ethnologia or ethnic studies, if that would be in English. I don't think people in generally in the Anglo-Saxon world use anything like that. There is something called ethnic studies, but it's not what is ethnologia. We'll get into it. So what does this mean? So I'm not going to get into the details of what is ethnos, right? But and how it slides very often into race and nationality, right? But the vast majority of focus used to be before the 90s on studying the kind of cultural practices of different ethnicities. This unfortunately coincides with a particular state socialist focus on kind of the state providing a vast scientific infrastructure and umbrella that would be inclusive to most, not all, but to most ethnic diversities in state socialist countries. And so this kind of ethnic studies at the time also had a political function to kind of represent the cultural practices of various communities that are not seen as indigenous, whatever indigenous means, right? But beyond this scientific function, there's also this aspect how ethnicity and the cultures of this ethnicity very often slides into either some form of what is called methodological nationalism in science, or in some kind of folkloric study, right? So I don't wanna derogate the studies done by people in state socialist times. There's a lot of important collection and studies of folklore, for example, but they're very ideological. That's fine. I have no problem with the fact that they're ideological so long as we articulate that, right? The notion of culture, it's then cultural studies, first part. So the second part will be, what do we see as cultural studies nowadays? But again, my approach to this is to kind of the political timing of where we are. And we are in Russia, contemporary context. Like the story can be told in many different ways, but I prefer to tell it in a kind of geographically focused manner. In the post-Soviet space, once in the early 90s, it was officially sanctioned to read and publish kind of literature that wasn't necessarily banned, but also wasn't necessarily widely acceptable. It was already a phenomenon. So what was this literature? In the late socialist years, there was a practice. You guys are pretty up to maybe know this. What would be the English translations? Служебные переводы, the service translations or internal translations. So there was this practice of translating, commissioning the translation of certain texts that the Central Party Committee will have to approve on a list, and then give the green light to somebody who is an expert from a philological department to translate this for a philosophical department. So this was very much under the kind of a very hierarchical umbrella of scientific history infrastructure, but it was sanctioned particularly in late socialism. I think in the Soviet Union a bit early. But I think other Soviet satellites, unlike my home country, Bulgaria, approved this maybe a little bit later. So why is this story important? So there was the reason why I'm telling it is because I really don't want to create the image that cultural studies is something that was introduced in the early 90s and was completely banned. I really don't approve of these kind of simplistic narratives. They're not proved to begin with, so that's enough. And so already in the 80s, I think in particular, there was in a relatively small circle of intellectuals, a circulation of, for example, Western Marxists and Marxists and theorists of culture. This was prioritized, who were seen as unorthodox. That is to say, they have something against the official Soviet interpretation of political economy. And therefore, everything else in the Soviet scientific imagination was subjugated to political economy and engineering. So that was on top of the scientific hierarchy, right? So culture is obviously on the lower side. because the 80s produced in this way in many places across the Soviet world very interesting intellectual results that then spilled over into teaching cultural studies in the 90s. So I'm pretty sure this is also the story in Russia. Like if you, I don't know, if you look at, I think he recently passed away, Valery Podoroga.
Yeah.
I think, yeah. But, you know, he might be, let's say in Russian context, somebody who's representative of, you know, people who had like a, you know, access to literature that normally isn't accessible to the wider readership. And these weren't published books, these were just kind of like zero-copied documents for internal use, right? Okay. So this story is, I think, a bit longer, but it traverses two time zones, before and after the fall of communism, right? So once this literature was acceptable, культурология was really introduced on a university level. And so let's also mention that, you know, normally people wouldn't study культурология in secondary schools, in secondary education. This is a you know, graduate level enterprise. And so very quickly across the board and the post-Soviet space, cultural studies programs were set up. Very quickly, anthologies of these translations were published. So some of those internal use translations actually made it to kind of like a series of anthologies as official publications, and of course new were commissioned. So this aspect of cultural studies in the post-Soviet space also has different dimension of introducing культурология and cultural studies, because what is the problem here? Problem is that because of the Soviet-induced focus on cultural diversity that's ethnic-focused and ethnic-related, there was a sense that there's something missing in our interpretation of culture. And this is clearly something that is widely seen by the very simple and banal fact that the anthologies that I'm talking about do not contain local authors. They're entirely, almost entirely, I think, I've seen different editions, not only in my home country, that they basically are compiled of translations. So you open these books and you're like, why is there no local interpretation of culture? Well, of course, this was because, and this is true for all of disciplines, this was because in early post-communist societies saw themselves through the eyes of West and through this kind of self-induced, but also induced from the West, but also West-induced deficiency, conceptual deficiency of talking about yourself and trying to take over the language of your kind of partner at the time, right? You know, freshly arriving capitalist forms of democracy. I mean, I'm saying capitalist because, you know, capitalism and democracy are opposite. You know, so that part of the story, as I said, traverses two time zones. And I think the 90s were a period where for the first kind of generations of educated people into cultural studies were produced, obviously, first graduates. But again, this doesn't mean that there were no earlier experts of culture. They were not, however, organized under the umbrella of a scientific structure the way they were in the 90s, right? And of course, the study of culture is a much earlier phenomenon. We can trace it to the 18th century. Now, let's get a bit more specific about the distinction культурология and cultural studies, because I think the post-communist version of культурология was a strange mixture of the two worlds, of, you know, communist and post-communist world, or liberal democratic. So if you look at a lot of the literature, it's kind of a hodgepodge between the two. Clearly, this conceptual deficiency I was talking about was exacerbated, particularly in the study of culture, because, you know, let's give some examples. What were the things people are interested in? Not many people at the time were interested in reading, I don't know, Lukács or Bloch. because, communism was over, so why should I read Western Marxism? This is very relevant, right? So the people were interested in things like Freud, for example, right? Let's read Freud. Let's read, maybe there isn't one exception on the Marxist side, but Marcuse, people like that. So there was a mushrooming of, for example, literature around psychoanalysis, etc., etc. It was widely used, particularly in the 90s, to analyze culture. And if you look at the local literatures in the post-Soviet space, there's all sorts of kind of psychoanalytical interpretation. This was the fashion thing, to analyze cultural phenomena and even national cultural icons through the prism of psychoanalysis, which was unheard of, and kind of a scientific blasphemy in the communist world, right? It took a while until the kind of local scientific elites of studying culture, so to speak, started to actually produce their own perspective. I would say this is a later phenomenon after the 2000s, maybe. Was obviously you have some foundational figures, but then you have to have 1-2 generations of educated scholars, right? So on the distinction, again, this is another long introductory note, but I'll stop with that. The concept of culture in cultural studies, which is the Anglo-Saxon notion to which I'm now switching, also historically charged, just like the kind of communist, kind of ethnic-focused studies. But it comes from a kind of different trajectory and political influence. And so, for example, a lot of cultural studies in its early phase in the Anglo-Saxon world is focused on studying tribal structures and tribal cultures. I don't know, Margaret Mead, scientific immigrants like Malinowski, people like that. So this gets imported in the 90s, right? But it's a somewhat different articulation of like historical understanding of culture. If let's focus on that. It's slightly different because from very early on, it came with the pretension of objectifying the other, right? Whereas I think like the so-called ethnologia, for example, in the communist world, it wasn't, at least officially, articulating that it's studying the certain community in a kind of objectifying manner. I think it had more kind of the aspect of course they did objectify them very often, but it had more the aspect of studying for the sake of taxonomy, for the sake of categorizing, cataloging certain cultures. And this is a very good thing. It still happens. So I think, for example, in the far eastern parts of Russia, there's very unique people who are working on preserving local languages and folkloric traditions, and I think this is fantastic. But what I'm talking about here is that this Western historical understanding of culture that started off with kind of intersection between history and anthropology, translated into kind of more abstract notion of culture, but that abstract notion of culture itself comes from a kind of very unconsciously arrogant attitude towards kind of balkanizing the other. So it's kind of so a lot of anthropologists who studied like tribal societies in Guyana or Latin America and places like that. That was state funded at the time in places like the US, obviously. A lot of these studies were, how to put it, they're good studies. Some of them are extraordinary studies, like Mary Douglas, for example, Purity and Danger, and books like that. But the Western gaze towards an indigenous culture, which is also a shared rule with the kind of Soviet version, is really kind of conceptually aggressive, I would say, right? So the Anglo-Saxon notion of kind of abstract version of culture comes with this kind of real political luggage of we need to study the culture of tribal societies to understand something about ourselves.
So it's just, if I may here just to recap a little bit, is that, and also try to understand the flow of ideas, is that orthologia was aimed at giving representations.
Yes, to a large extent, you can say that.
Yeah. On the
Kind of identity politics of the Soviet.
for example, this scientific identity politics. Exactly, yeah. But on the other hand, when the cultural studies started to emerge, it was aimed at simply trying to reflect on this simply, I don't know, it reflect on the culture of the subject that is studying the object through the eyes of the object.
Right.
Yeah. So in this regard, is that here there was an aim to represent, but yeah, we can simply speculate more. I mean, not speculate. I mean, we can analyze that what does the representation means, because it had a political end, as you put here. But with cultural studies, it has kind of utilitarian maybe aim.
Yes, but there is no problem with utilitarianism, because scientific knowledge should be used.
Of course.
There is no problem with that. The problem is that once the Anglo-Saxon kind of version of cultural studies started forming, so it was built onto this kind of interesting intersection between historical anthropology, history and anthropology, and it started off with kind of the pretension that we're studying something from these others, but why are we doing this?
Yeah.
Right. So the Anglo-Saxon, this is not trashing, obviously, the Anglo-Saxon kind of focus, but the Anglo-Saxon version has a slightly different articulation. It's not so representational, as you said, but it's very utilitarian. But it's done in the name of something else.
I see.
It's done in the name of something else. Let's put it there.
Yeah, what in your opinion, what is this something else? Because I understand that sometimes it is being transformed in that, in the sense of that we need to understand the other, or that sometimes it sounds nice.
Right. This kind of otherness to be studied is not necessarily a bad thing. It becomes bad thing when there is a certain disjunction between the notion of what's a human, right?
Yeah.
And so this is when problems arise, and this is when science can be very controversial, and this is when the utilitarianism in question can be very problematic. Well, the earlier scientific infrastructure of the U.S. State was very well funded by the state, which changed over time to private endowments and stuff like that. But one aspect is preserved to this very day. A lot of cultural anthropologists go to study societies that are war-torn by the U.S. So sometimes they go before, sometimes they go during, sometimes they go after a conflict. And this is not anecdotal, it's true. There is plenty of anthropologists, for example, who are being killed during their studies. And they're being funded by the FBI. So this is not the conspiracy theory. This is actually a real endowment, state endowment that functions this way. So this is where it becomes problematic. Not always, but sometimes problematic, right? Because it does look like we need to study a local culture so that we know how to control it, right? So it's a problem of power. It's a problem of how do we know how to control a society or a culture? Well, we do it through science. I just think that this kind of Soviet version is slightly more naive in some sense, not stupid, certainly, and I don't mean that by naive, but it had its own problems. It clearly, in the post-Soviet space, you can see all these kind of ethnicized nationalisms and conflicts, which clearly indicates that, something hasn't been done right.
Of course, yeah. Okay, so, and in the mix of all of that, I like so much that you draw the attention to the geography and where we are coming from. I mean, how the trajectory of the studying of culture has been simply either evolved here in Russia, in the post-Soviet state, and then with the interaction of the West, and then seeing the post-Soviet and or certainly early the Russian, the contemporary Russian state, seeing their simply themselves just with the eyes of the West and all of that. And in the mix of all of these right now, we have here at the school, we have the major cultural studies. So, and you being the major leader, how do you see then what is the cultural studies then
at the school? Okay, so before we go to the school, I haven't given part of the story on cultural studies yet. Of course, so he went into comparative.
Yeah.
So I'll go to this. I don't know how much time we have. We spoke quite a lot, I guess. Anyway, so once there is a more abstract, in other words, theoretical notion of culture that's being produced in the Anglo-Saxon world, and this means UK also. Obviously, there's a lot of meaningful work being done there. Once this is done, and you can say that there's this kind of explosion of studying culture in the 1960s.
Mm-hmm.
So this happens the 1960s is a very politically charged moment in both US and European history, but this explosion of interest in culture in the 1960s follows this kind of initial phase of ordering, kind of the indigenous cultures, right? Through mostly the means of anthropology. At the time, it wasn't called cultural anthropology. I do speak about cultural anthropology because it's something that I use a lot in the cultural studies program. So after the 60s, there's this kind of normalization of culture has to be studied, and it is institutionalized in the Anglo-Saxon worlds in the 70s and the 80s. So type-wise, this isn't that different from a kind of Eastern European interest in it. They just differ, as we discussed, in certain ways, and use this. Now, when you look at contemporary programs being taught, especially in the Western world, they themselves have two different tracks, so to speak. So this is important because the story partly fuses back into kulturologia, the kind of Russian version of it. For example, some of our colleagues in our university outside of SAS are well aware of this and probably teach in certain ways. So the problem here is that you have these two tracks, and one of them is so-called critical theory. So this kind of explosion and booming of studying culture in the Anglo-Saxon world came through Jewish immigrants who had to flee, most of them in New York. And the conventional stories is a lot of these people were at the New School for Social Research in New York. Still exists, very prestigious institution. It somehow became like this beacon of critical theory and studying society through all sorts of means. But culture was a very big focus already there. So there is this kind of transcontinental aspect of the development of how do we study culture, because it comes from Europe, from European intellectuals who migrate during their persecution of the European Jewry. So this is one track, the critical theory, right? And it I'll go to it because it has a lot to do with the program here. And then you have something that kind of coincides partially with culturologia, but not entirely. Then you have something that is coming from a very long trajectory, so it's not 20th century. It starts with approximately general romanticism. This is an approach that is not unknown in the Soviet period. I think it is, to the extent to which classical culture was selectively approved. I mean, let's say Hegel, Schelling, and people like that, who had a very nationalistic, patriotic, is the word, a very patriotic understanding of culture, right? And they articulated in this highly intellectualized, abstract way that led to something that's called later philosophy of art and philosophy of culture. So Hegel is very much responsible for the first part. Philosophy of culture is slightly different phenomenon, but often in the post-Soviet and post-Soviet and Soviet context, one part of Kulturologia coincides with this trajectory, this track of studying culture through a kind of also European, German, classical, coded understanding of culture as something that expresses the spirit of the nation. Okay, and this is something that I have to say is spontaneously understood by people to this very day, without German romanticism, right? So you don't have to actually have a degree in anything to experience culture as expressive of your own community, in terms of nation in particular. But it was packed and conceptualized over time through the kind of development of the German educational models. That was very dominant in the 19th century, and obviously had a big influence on Russian education, and a lot of big influence on other Soviet satellites. So partly philosophy of culture is coinciding with culturologia, and the other part is, we discussed it at the beginning, kind of ethnology, right? And what they have to do in common is kind of this kind of endogenous focus on culture. It's something local, right? You don't just find culture elsewhere. You have to look around, right? And now to the critical theory part, which is where we are mostly at SAS. What we teach here, I mean, I have to say, I've been a major leader of this program for nearly a year. So I gradually make changes. There are no revolutionary changes in what I found so far, but there's a couple of courses that I have to overhaul. And critical theory, for example, is something that we teach at this school, at the cultural studies program here, and it is extremely important. Why do we promote it, for example? So it's not called cultural theory, right? It's called critical theory. And so I'm not sure we have the time to introduce what is critical theory to the viewers, but now I will rely on people's curiosity up to a point. But the critical theory is this kind of transcontinental intellectual product, which I already mentioned, leads to an understanding of culture that is not focused in extracting an intellectual habit or mindset entirely from the individual. Why? Because in the 20th century, people who produced something we call today critical theory started to understand that culture is produced by masses. It's produced in a context of mass society. Mass society wasn't the phenomenon up until late 19th century in general. Let's not get too much detail. So the critical theorists understood that you have to frame notions of culture through looking at society as a big structure, right? Because of today's globalized world, because the way culture is being transmitted through all sorts of means, and it's much more democratized, we have much more knowledge, and etc., etc. I have to say critical theory is still a very good tool for studying culture so that you don't isolate. So one of the big pluses of teaching critical theory as a segue into studying culture for us at SAS is that we want to focus on the understanding and availability of culture everywhere and in general, but with the mindset that you don't look at the individual or you don't look at the community as such, right? So you need to understand whatever notion of culture you have, because there's so many, you need to understand them through vast structures of codependencies, which is mass society. I mean, so we spoke about the cultural studies of SAS, and particularly I focused on the one particular course, which is called critical theory, and I focused on it because I wanted to articulate that we're dealing with the notion of culture that comes with intellectual background that doesn't look for culture in something like the community, or kind of like small, more intimate, comfortable structures, but looks at culture as a kind of vast, networked phenomenon that's kind of world widespread. And that's why I focused on this, but there's more to say, because we have other courses. We also teach a course that's called Foundations of Humanities, which is fairly abstract, and it's not just cultural studies, but it's kind of mixed bag of different texts and writers. Some of them are philosophers, some of them are quite a lot of cultural anthropologists, Clifford Geertz, for example, who do excellent job at the kind of transcultural approach of conceptualizing this kind of more abstract form of culture, right? So we don't want to isolate students. And again, this doesn't mean that the Russian or post-Soviet understanding of culturologia is bad. It doesn't mean that. But, we offer something at SAS that is generally not offered across the board in Russian higher education. And the difference here is that we've put more focus on how to integrate culture and how to see the integration of culture, even if it's a very small local one, in a wider context of a multidimensional world, right? So we don't need to look at culture as the culture of the Chukchi or anything like that, right? That's not what we do here, right? If we look at the culture of the Chukchi, then our students, if they want to study that, they will have to have an approach that is not doesn't come only from the Russian scientific infrastructure, right? Which is again not to say that there's something wrong with a local approach, because what I told you at the beginning was for me it was always problematic that the early 90s was all translations, no local knowledge. Everything was like, let's translate and read the Western writers, right? So we're at the stage where this is not the case. There's a lot of local production. We have a great bookshop here that is a testimony to that, right?
I see. So the aim is just to let the students be exposed to this. I like so much of this thing about the fact that we're approaching critical theory, because it gives us this transcontinental kind of scope.
But it is transcontinental. It's fascinating because it comes from Europe to the US. Right?
Exactly. Yeah, that's what I mean.
But then it spills over through globalization.
Yeah.
In the 90s, it spills over, especially through globalization. Science. One of the few sustainably good features of globalization is scientific democratization.
Yeah.
This is one of the really good aspects of what we saw in the 90s up to early 2000s.
Yeah, and I'm just saying is that I like this point so much because I can feel it. I'm myself a graduate of cultural studies, and I simply had this I would say very, very well-rounded view of this. I mean, the scope of ideas around the globe. So you are saying, for example, it became like a global thing. No problem, but I just lied with the fact that I wasn't isolated, and I actually, I can even sense this thing because since I studied that, of course, I know, for example, that the course changed over the years quite a lot. Yeah, quite a lot, right? But yeah, this was it. Thank you so much, Stanimir, for coming.
Well done.
So guys, if you will have any questions, comments, or any kind of suggestions, please leave them in the comments, and of course we will be in touch, and that's it. See you.